Hey guys, today we're looking at 3 budget CPU coolers from Arctic that I've been using for a while. So I thought, why not do a little roundup? Maybe you're looking at a CPU cooler for your retro build or for your modern system, and you come across these models and you're not sure which one to pick. There are the specs on the website, of course, but after using them, I've got my personal opinions on the compatibility, noise, and all of that stuff. So we're looking at the Alpine 11 Revision 2. We've got the Alpine 11 Pro Revision 2, and here we've got the Alpine 11 Plus. So in this video we will first cover what these coolers have in common, then we will go over the specifications for each of these coolers, followed by some benchmark results looking at the temperatures and the fan speed. And then we're gonna grab a motherboard and we have a look at the installation process for all of these coolers. And here I share my thoughts about any issues with the installation, fan noise, clearance around the socket, and anything else that I noticed. All 3 coolers have a few things in common. They all have 92mm fans with PWM and 4-pin connectors. We have fluid dynamic bearing. There is pre-applied thermal paste in all of these coolers, and they are compatible with the socket 775 as well as all the 1150X, and we have 6 years of warranty. Let's take a closer look at the coolers and go over the specifications on the box. The Alpine 11 has a maximum cooling capacity of 96 watts. It weighs 370 grams. Dimensions are 100 by 96 by 87. The fan spins between 900 and 2000 RPM depending on the configuration of your motherboard BIOS and the fan curve. The noise is 0.4 zone, and the mounting system uses the traditional Intel push pin system, and we're looking at $11.99. The Alpine 11 Pro Revision 2 has a maximum cooling capacity of 95 watts. It's a little bit heavier at 428 grams. It's also a lot larger. Dimensions are 105 by 113 by 85. It does go a little bit lower with the RPM, between 500 and 2000 RPM. The noise is the same, 0.4 zone, and the mounting system uses 1 plastic frame plus 2 screws, and we will have a look at that later, how to install these coolers. And the price, you're looking at $13.99. And here we have the Alpine 11 Plus. This one has the highest cooling capacity of 100 watts. It is the heaviest with 450 grams. It is also the most compact one with 98 by 95 by 70. The fan can spin between 600 and 2000 RPM. Noise is also 0.4 zone, but I will make a few comments on the noise levels later. The mounting system uses 2 plastic frames plus 4 screws, and the price is also $13.99. I think it's time for some benchmarks. Here we've got our test setup with a i7-4790. We've got 8 GB of RAM, dual channel config, Windows 10, and we're using the OCCT CPU stress test software. Keep in mind it's quite cold in Australia at the moment. Idle temperatures were between 27 and 31 degrees. And also with the results, keep in mind that a lot depends on the motherboard BIOS and what sort of a fan curve you've got configured. Here we have the results for the Alpine 11 with the fan set to auto and full speed. So on auto between 52 and 53 degrees and the fan at 1700 RPM, and setting the fan to max speed, which measured at 2200 RPM, we're getting between 49 and 52 degrees. On the Alpine 11 Pro, we're seeing similar temperatures with the auto fan profile between 51 and 53 degrees. The fan spins a little bit higher at 1800 RPM, and with the profile set to max speed, we can see the fan spins a little bit faster at 2300 RPM with temperatures between 50 and 51 degrees. On the Alpine 11 Plus, we saw temperatures between 51 and 54 degrees with a fan speed that's a little bit higher than the others of 1957. And with the fan profile set to max speed, we can see it spins at 2250 RPM and temperatures between 50 and 52 degrees. So now we're going to have a look at the installation process, and I share any observations and opinions on the cooler. So first up, we've got the Alpine 11. Orientation does matter, so this flat side has to be in parallel with the lever here, and then you just line it up with the mounting holes. You might have to wiggle it around a little bit, it's fairly obvious. Then push down the cooler, and then you push in the pins in a diagonal fashion. You should hear like a little click, and that's it. The cooler is now installed. So my thoughts on this cooler: firstly, there are no parts that can go missing. I've got quite a few coolers in my lab, and this definitely helps. The installation process is really quick. If you're working on many projects, or like I do, that might matter. Also, there are no clearance issues. The cooler is nice and compact, so be it VRMs or memory being really close to the socket, there are no issues with clearance. In terms of noise, maybe it's the open design, but compared to the other two coolers, this one seems the loudest out of the three. Not saying this is a loud cooler at all. It's quite quiet compared to the boxed cooler, of course, but in comparison to the other two coolers. Installing the Alpine 11 Pro is a bit more effort. We get this plastic frame here with these 4 pins that go through the motherboard holes. Orientation does matter. We have the lever here, and at a 90-degree axis we have to install that bracket. But we're running into a bit of an issue with the RAM modules, and if we turn it around you can see that we have some clearance issue here. And on this particular motherboard, the RAM slots are really close to the socket, so that's something you need to check with your motherboard. So you've got a couple of choices. If you only have one RAM module in your machine, you can just move it to the outer slot, then you will be fine. The other option is you can use low profile memory. So if you haven't bought the parts yet and you want to use this cooler because it's extremely quiet, and I will comment on that later in the video, you can just get some low profile memory, and that's what I was forced to do in order to do the benchmarks with this cooler. So we can now continue with the installation process. So we're just going to line it up, and I'm going to use a screwdriver just to push these little pins through the PCB, and that's it. Make sure they're all nicely inserted. And what comes next, we're using these little pins, and you just have to push them through in order to secure the frame to the motherboard. So that's all done, and now we can install the cooler. You can see these 2 holes here, and we've got 2 screws there. You just line it up that way. So we just install it like that, and then all you have to do is take a screwdriver and you just tighten the screws, that one over here and the other one on the other side. So my thoughts on the 11 Pro: there's one feature that makes this cooler a really killer feature, and that is this here. So the top fan is mounted with this rubber mounting system, which basically decouples it from the rest of the cooler, so there are no vibrations that can travel from the fan to the other parts of the system. And what I found is that a lot of the noise coming from a system, especially if you're into a quiet machine, will actually come from the vibrations and not so much from the fan pushing air. And so basically the bottom line is this is the quietest cooler out of the lot. Especially sitting idle on the desktop with a quiet fan profile, this cooler is inaudible. You will not hear it. Even plugging in a USB portable hard drive makes more noise than this cooler. So if you're building something like a home theater PC, or noise in general is something that you care about, definitely check out this cooler. On the flip side, you might have some mounting issues depending on the motherboard. This is a fairly budget motherboard, so there's not much clearance, but on higher end motherboards you won't run into that issue. There's more clearance between the RAM slots and the processor cooler. And finally, it has a lot of little parts which can get lost. That might not be an issue if you're using it in a permanent build, but for me, that just means I have to make sure that all the parts stay together. And the installation process is a little bit more involved compared to the Arctic 11. And next up, we've got the 11 Plus. It uses a very similar mounting system to the 11 Pro. But instead of getting one contained frame, we're getting 2 parts, and you install these in parallel to the lever. So basically you install it like that. There's one. And once again, I just use a screwdriver to make sure that this is pushed through. And the other one goes on the other side with the these arms here pointing outwards. So there you go, that's that one. And the other one, and then it's the same as before, you have these pins and you just push them through in order to secure these frames to the motherboard. And once again, the orientation of the actual cooler does matter. That flat side here has to be in parallel to the lever and these mounting frames, and you just place it on top like that and just push it down. And now we're almost done. There are 4 screws which have to go in here, and one of it's not an issue but just an observation, is that you have to screw them in from a bit of an angle. Now you can make that easier by removing the actual fan. You just have to pull this out. You can remove the fan, and now it's a bit easier to go in with the screwdriver and screw it in down nice and straight. So this is after the installation. We don't have any clearance issues with the memory. Let's have a look at the VRM area, and there's a bit of a tight spot here with that little spring attachment here. It's a bit tight, but there's no contact, so it's just a little bit tight. So once again, that might be something to look at. And now what we're going to do is just pop the fan back onto the cooler, and that's not going to take us long. So we just align it, push it down, and off we go. And that's how you install the Alpine 11 Plus. So my thoughts on the 11 Plus. Firstly, we have a sleeved fan cable, which is nice. In terms of cooling performance on paper, this one is the strongest cooler, but that did not show up in the benchmarks, and I'm not quite sure why. I actually reseated the cooler once again just to be sure, but yeah, it needed slightly higher RPM than the other 2 coolers. In terms of noise, I place it in between the other 2, so it's not as quiet as the 11 Pro, because this one doesn't have that decoupling mechanism to get rid of the vibrations, but it's quieter than the standard Alpine 11. You shouldn't have clearance issues with this cooler unless you run into something like I have with this push pin here for the VRM cooler, but at least with the memory you shouldn't have any issues. As you can see here, you can install really tall memory without any issues. And lastly, this cooler has the most parts, so if you lose one of the screws, that's annoying. So that's also something to keep in mind. Not an issue if you're doing a permanent build, but for me, where I frequently install and remove coolers, this one takes longer to install, and yeah, that's just something to be aware of. So guys, let's wrap up this video. All these 3 coolers did a fantastic job at cooling the 4770, but there are slight differences, so I'm just going to give you my thoughts. In general, overall value, I think the Alpine 11 is the best cooler. Not only is it the cheapest, it also performs very well, outperforming the other coolers by a small margin. It is also the easiest to install in my opinion. There are no parts that you can lose, so that is my overall recommendation if you're looking for a value cooler. Also in terms of compatibility with the motherboard, socket area and clearance issues with RAM slots, you will not have any issues with this cooler. Now if noise is your priority and you want to build a machine that is inaudible basically, then the 11 Pro is a really unique processor cooler with the fan mounting system here, decoupling all the vibrations. This is very unique. There are not many fans that have this system. So if noise is your number one concern, this is the quietest cooler out of the 3. The main issue we had was clearance issues around the motherboard socket area. So have a look on your motherboard. If there's enough distance between the RAM socket and the processor, then you should be fine. You can also use low profile memory slots, and then you should also be fine. And finally, we've got the Alpine 11 Plus. On paper, it had the highest cooling capacity, but that didn't really show up in the benchmarks. So this is a cooler you might want to go for if you don't like the push pin system on the boxed coolers or on the Alpine 11. It also has it's the only one with a sleeved cables. That might also be a factor to consider. And it has less clearance issues around the socket area compared to the 11 Pro. And there you have it, guys. We had a look at 3 budget processor coolers from Arctic. Let me know what you think. Any thoughts, feedback, leave them down below in the comments. And also if you want to see more CPU coolers on this channel. And if you enjoyed the video, be sure to give it a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Click on that notification bell so you're getting all the updates. And that's it. Thank you so much for watching, and I shall see you soon with another one.